Hey guys, welcome to the seventh edition of Lunch Hour. My name is Chris Sparks. I'm the founder of Forcing Function, and I'm going to be your MC for today. And today we have a very special guest. I'm very excited to welcome Taylor Pearson to the show. So, before we get started, just let everyone know the chat is open. And so by default, you can see that it just goes to all panelists. So unless you have a secret just for Taylor and I encourage you to change that to all panelists and attendees. And so while I'm going for my little spiel, would love to know what brings you here. Is there a trend that you have your eye on? Is there something you're looking to learn today? The more you share, the more we can share with you. So quick introduction on Forcing Function, who we are, what we do. So Forcing Function does what I call executive performance training. And so at Forcing Function, we teach you how to maximize your productivity and become a high performer. If you're more interested in what we do, it'd send you to two places. So our website's forcingfunction.com. We have a free workbook that's available, which is all of the techniques that I use with my private clients. You can download that for free at forcingfunction.com/workbook. We also talk that there's so many ways that you can improve yourself. It's hard to know where to get started. And so we created a free quiz that we call the performance assessment. And this is how we illuminate your biggest opportunity for growth. If you take the quiz, we'll give you a personalized recommendation on the best thing you could be doing right now to become a high performer. So if you're attending today, we're gonna be putting you on our monthly newsletter where we announce upcoming events. So we're doing these lunch hours twice a month moving forward. And the next lunch hour is going to be on October 15th with Spencer Greenberg. So we're gonna be talking about how to make better decisions, a very topical concept right now. And so keep an eye out for that email on Tuesday. It'll give you the registration link. I want to introduce our guest, Taylor. Many of you guys are well familiar with his work, but those who aren't, Taylor is an author, an investor, and I think this term is overused, but very apt in his case. He's definitely a futurist. Taylor is the author of the book End of Jobs, which talks about our entrepreneurial future. And he's working on a new book about the cascading effects of Bitcoin and blockchaining. Taylor is the principal of Mutiny Fund, which is a tail risk hedge fund, talking about how you can benefit from volatility. And he also invests directly in internet software businesses. So many of you guys know Taylor from his excellent writing online at taylorpearson.me. And Taylor shares mental models for thinking better about productivity, marketing, and investing. He was incredibly valuable in the early creation of Experiment Without Limits curriculum. And I like to think about his superpower is Taylor thinks very deeply. So many people see things that are happening, but Taylor goes the extra mile as far as what are the implications of what is happening. We've both done a little bit of improv, and one of my favorite concepts from improv is if this is true, what else is true? I think Taylor is one of the best at taking this next step about implications. Some of you guys might be curious how Taylor and I met. I believe it was through the Dynamite Circle. We met up in New York City. Dynamite Circle is one of these subcultures that we'll talk about that gives you a unique lens into entrepreneurship and where business is heading. And Taylor did an annual retreat. It was on a lake in Alabama. And if I trace back some of the most interesting people that I know, all roads lead through Taylor. So I owe him a debt of gratitude for bringing those people together. What to expect for today? Today, our goal is to show you how to both recognize present trends and then extrapolate them into the future. And what is the goal of that? The goal is for you to become more anti-fragile. What does that mean? That uncertainty goes from a threat to an opportunity. The world is dynamic, things are constantly in flux, but this does not need to be something that you're afraid of. In fact, if you're able to position yourself correctly, all changes become opportunities. So the timeline for today, Taylor and I are going to be having a fireside chat conversation for about 40 minutes. And then we're going to hand it off for Q&A. So we're going to be wrapping at 15 minutes past the hour. If you're on Eastern, that'll be 1:15 p.m. ET. If you have something to say, chat is open. I encourage you to switch that to all attendees. Yes, all attendees, if you'd like everyone to see that. For the Q&A portion, I'm going to be asking questions on your behalf, and we are only taking questions through the Q&A function. So you can see that at the bottom bar. You can click on that. You can submit a question. You can also upvote questions. And so I'm going to be asking the questions which are most upvoted. So if you see something that is interesting to you, upvote it so that question can get to the top. Everyone's favorite question, hey, I have to leave early. Is this going to be recorded? Absolutely. I wouldn't let this conversation go to waste. You're going to be getting the recording as well as the full transcript in an email on Tuesday. So keep an eye out for that. With all that being said, I wanted to hand things off to Taylor and kick off today's conversation. Taylor, so many ways we could get started, but I think talking about your book, End of Jobs, is a great place to get started. End of Jobs is really about the future of work, how typical organization man corporate work is going to be gradually replaced by freelancing and entrepreneurship. And I would love to know, what were the experiences that allowed you to get that insight?
Yeah, I mean, first, thanks for having me. After that introduction, I expect everything I say will be pretty disappointing. So it's all downhill from here, but that's good. Get the expectations down. Yeah, I guess sort of to start there, we were sort of talking before about themes and how things come to that. I think, one of the ideas I found very interesting and impactful on me has been this idea of kind of optimizing for interesting. Thinking about, and there's a paper, I believe the guy's a MIT professor or some sort of AI research person named Jürgen Schmidhuber, and he has this paper called Driven by Compression Progress. And it's a very speculative paper, but basically speculates that the emotion interesting is an emotion that evolved to indicate where you have compression progress, right? And where you can compress information in an efficient way, right? So, E equals MC squared is a compression of information in an efficient way, right? You can explain a vast amount of physical phenomena with whether Einstein's, relativity kind of thing. And that, that's sort of an extreme example. But I think that general idea has always been interesting to me. And so, coming back to sort of the End of Jobs and how that happened, I was working, my first job after college, I was a translator. I was a medical interpreter for about a year after college, and I taught English in Brazil. And while I was teaching English in Brazil, I started listening to these, at the time, very weird niche things called podcasts. And there were all these people doing podcasts that were talking about how you could sell stuff to people on the internet. And that was a thing now that people, and obviously this was, Amazon was around, but e-commerce was still a very small thing. And the idea that a career path was sort of sell people things on the internet or leverage the internet in some way was at least certainly not something I was exposed to. I didn't have any friends in high school or college that worked in tech or finance or anything like that. I had friends that were lawyers and doctors and worked at banks and that kind of stuff. And I just thought that was such an interesting idea. And I started listening to all these podcasts, and I bought some books on how search engine optimization worked at the time. That was a big, people were talking, I guess it still is a big thing, but, and started building websites and, taught myself WordPress and was sort of mucking around with that stuff. And that ended up turning into a job. I worked for an e-commerce company based out of California for a couple of years. And as you mentioned, the Dynamite Circle that we met through, they also started that, was their other business. And it was basically a forum, a subculture. They had an event, they still do, obviously not in COVID times, about, how people selling stuff on the internet, sort of internet-based businesses would come together and, talk about what they were doing and whatever tips and tricks and all that kind of stuff. And, I had the idea for the book. I was actually at their annual conference, and I was having breakfast. I can't remember, with a few different people there. And it just occurred to me, it just seemed very obvious to me that all these things we were talking about, this is how the world, no one else kind of got, not no one else, but relatively few people sort of understood that like this was how things work now. And it just seemed like very apparent to me that like there was this huge secular trend. It was driven by this like technological change that wasn't going to reverse itself. And then if you you kind of solve for the equilibrium point, right? Like we have this new change and like we haven't seen the effect of the change, but like at some point there is an equilibrium, and like what does that equilibrium look like? So kind of the idea behind the end of jobs was like, what is that equilibrium point out into the future, right? If you take this sort of trend, like what the internet allowed people to do with their careers and how it changed careers, and you just follow to the logical conclusion. You're not anticipating anything new. You're just sort of taking what you already see and just drawing it out as far as it will sort of logically go. That was kind of the impetus for that book.
What do you think you were seeing that others were missing because you were a part of these subcultures and kind of exploring things on the internet independently?
I mean, I think the thing that sort of like made the idea click in my head was this idea of you either call it like the long tail or like transaction costs. So like there's a good long tail is probably the easiest way to talk about. This is a concept. I think guy Chris Anderson, he's an editor at Wired magazine, and he wrote this book. It's like mid 2000s maybe, but the idea was basically on the internet. If you sell, to take like music as an example, if you had you went into Tower Records when like CD stores were still a thing. Like Tower Records, maybe they had 20,000 CDs. I don't know what they're 20,000, 30,000 CDs. But there were 10 million CDs that could possibly be bought. But like the nature of, if you're selling, you have physical retail space is, there's a marginal cost to stocking additional product, right? Like you have to make the store physically bigger. You have to pay for the real estate, you have to pay for someone to maintain it. And so there's a transaction cost involved with that. And then there's also like search costs. Like you would go and like it took a while to find the CD you wanted, right? Like you'd have to go and like, is it in the rock section or is it in the pop section, or like however it was categorized. And sort of what he observed was once you had the internet, there was effectively zero marginal cost to like stocking additional product, right? Amazon has, I don't know, 100 million books available right now or something like that. I mean, that doesn't work. You can't have, Barnes and Nobles can't have 100 million books. And then, I think the other interesting thing was, one stat I find interesting is like the number of Amazon third-party sellers, right? So this isn't, part of Amazon's business looks kind of like Walmart's business, right? So they go out to Tide and they cut a deal with Tide and they sell Tide on the website and people get their Tide and it's like, okay, that's fine. But then you also end up with all these sort of like these just like sort of weird niche, laundry detergent for people that have gluten insensitivity and, live in low light climates, and you can, do something with a laundry detergent that's different or whatever. And like those sorts of businesses work on the internet, these sort of very niche things, because you have this relatively low transaction cost. You've sort of removed this tyranny of geography, if you will. All of a sudden you can, if you have, enough market of global, you don't have to have enough of a market locally, you just need to have enough of a market globally for sort of whatever it is you're doing. And so I think that that was sort of the main idea. And then it was just like, oh, well, and and I think like music was maybe one of the first places we saw that happen, books, like media to some extent. And it was just kind of like, okay, well, let's just assume, the underlying thing there is the same, right? Like it's not any different. Like I think like one recent iteration of that is this like a paid newsletter trend, right? It's like if you write a paid newsletter on, corporate earnings where you analyze companies' S1s or, public filings or whatever, like it doesn't really work as a newspaper, right? There's like not enough people in, even like New York City, certainly not like Duluth, Minnesota or whatever that are gonna, I don't actually know where Duluth is. It might not be in Minnesota, but it doesn't work geographically, but it totally works on the internet, right? Like there's 1,000 or 2,000 people that would pay $100 or $200 a year because they're really interested in that sort of material. And so in terms of like sort of how people approach their careers, like the big thing was like just this ability to sort of work independently of a large corporation, right? You could take that, if you were really good at writing S1s on public companies or had some alternative Thai competitor for people with celiac or whatever. All of a sudden, like that was like a viable business, and like that was a viable career path that just like wasn't sort of broadly appreciated.
Yeah, I want to pull on that thread a little bit where just the recognition of one secular trend, like the long tail, the ability to reach these increasingly narrow niches, and not only to build businesses and subcultures around them, but to almost create a beachhead for which to expand, right? Amazon starting off with books and then expanding to being the everything store. Would you see these niches starting to build? Let's say something like a blockchain, where in the beginning it's just a small subset of people who are able to congregate together on the internet, share information, collaborate on open source projects. What do you see as that next step for an early subculture like that to start to get momentum?
Momentum in like sort of it being broader, more people knowing about it, or
Right, moving from the curve, right? You have the super early adopters to the late early adopters, right? How does it start to move up that curve?
right? Yeah, I mean, I guess now that we're all amateur epidemiologists, we can do the infectious disease correlate, right? It's everyone knows the R naught, right? There's if one person gets COVID or whatever, you infect on average X number of people, and so if the R is greater than 1, it's an exponential trend, right? And like you could this was like Dropbox and like PayPal's early user acquisition thing was like you signed up and you got $20 for free. And if you referred a friend, I think like you got $20 and they got $20. And so like on average, one person referred 1.5 people. And so like if that just keeps compounding, it's going to go to infinity. And eventually it's not going to go to infinity because it's going to hit some asymptote. So I think that's sort of like the way I look at to take the internet business example or the blockchain or crypto example. Like you could just see, I saw many times, for myself, but then talking to other people, like people have been like, oh yeah, like that it would click, and it was infectious in some extent, right? It's like people would hear about it and start doing it, and it sort of made sense. And I think it's this idea of like information asymmetry, or just like what that other people don't know, or what your subculture knows that other people don't know. Where it's not like you've analyzed it in some brilliant novel way. It's just like the world is a really big place, and time and whatever is limited, and so not everyone knows everything all the time. And these things start small and then slowly compound. So if you see something that has that sort of compounded growth rate, where it's spreading, you can kind of infer, this is going to keep growing.
I want to ask about that phenomenon because I find it so interesting where everyone lives in a different reality. We all are in our bubbles. And so things just feel so normal for us and sometimes can feel even overplayed, right? I remember talking about Bitcoin like 2010, 2011, and like 2013 comes around and I'm like, everyone already knows it at this point and it hasn't gotten big. Okay, it's over. And here we are like 2020 and we're still talking about, when full adoption comes. And it's that when you're immersed in something, it seems very easy to take for granted. I'm curious, does this bring something to mind for you where everyone around you is pursuing something where it just becomes normal and you sort of underestimate, hey, here, how big this niche thing could become?
Yeah, I mean, one for me was definitely just like Amazon. Like I remember going to this conference. It would have been like 2014, 2015. Everyone's like, oh, you like Amazon? Is like they had already had it, but they were like opening up their third-party seller program where you could like sell stuff on Amazon. And people were like, oh, you can go source these products in China and like put them on Amazon. And like everyone I knew was doing this, and I was like, this is so played out. Like I don't want, who's going to do this? This is going to be dumb. And the growth has just been massive over the last 5 years. It's like up 5,000x or something insane. Not that, anyway, a lot. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that's that's tricky. And like another one of those for me was like podcast. Like I was a podcast producer in 2012, and I remember thinking like, this is kind of like, these are cool, like, but like, you know, everyone kind of already does some of this stuff, and like, how popular is this going to be? And you know, the answer was like way more popular. And, you know, now Joe Rogan has a gajillion listeners, and This American Life, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think it's, you know, I don't know. I think it's, you have to have some sort of broader, I guess maybe what helped me at least with that is like, you have to get out of the bubble to some extent, right? You know, it's like when you're in the same bubble with the same people all the time, you just assume that that's all there is. What Danny Kahneman has the Wasiati, what you see is all there is, right? That's sort of the core of all the cognitive biases. You just assume that, you know, what's sort of most visible to you is always present out there. So, you know, like, so I use that a lot of times I use like friends from college or friends from high school, or, you know, like people that just live, you know, we live in different worlds now kind of thing. They're just, you know, different sort of subcultures that we interact with. And, you know, just kind of using them as like a rough proxy for like, what do people that are like not involved in this at all think about it, right? And like, you know, with Bitcoin still, most of them it's like scam, or I wonder if I can get rich really quick buying this kind of thing. You know, that's the general thinking. So.
Yeah, I love that. Realizing that we already have secrets. You refer to them as an information asymmetry, things that we just dismiss as normal because the bubble we find ourselves in, they are normal. And I said one of my favorite quotes is the William Gibson, "The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed." That in some sense, we are already living in a subset of the future. And seeing the things that we think are normal, could those become normal for more people? It seems like a big part of your success is your ability to optimize for interestingness. If I remember correctly, your first URL was something like frontier living, right? It's like you're living on the frontier, exploring all of these edges. I would love to hear you talk about that. That seems kind of key to, you know, the canary in the coal mine, seeing some of these things early on. How do you manage to live on the frontier?
Yeah, it's always, I always think of the Heart of Darkness, the Joseph Conrad novel. He has this part, it's like the prologue maybe, but it's this idea of like, he wanted to go where like the map wasn't filled in, right? And like Africa was this fascinating place because like, you know, at that time, the center of the continent was like just no one from the, you know, no Europeans at least knew it. That just like was a sort of like blank map. And yeah, I think that, and to some extent just philosophically, that's like always been an interesting idea. So yeah, I think my first blog was called frontierliving.com. There's no G because that domain was taken. I didn't want to pay for another domain. So it wasn't the best URL choice, but yeah, I think to some extent that was just always like a really interesting idea. And I think was just like, I think to some extent, like I've always kind of had the attitude of, you know, even I go back to like sort of initial careers. Like I was planning to go to law school. I was like studying for the LSAT, and I was going to do this stuff. I was just like not interested in it. And I was like, if I do something else and I make like much less money and it's less prestigious, but it's like more interesting and fun, like that's cool with me. Like I'm like fine with that trade-off. And you know, I think the paper I'm interested in, this idea of interesting is obviously, you know, I like the idea because like not only is this more fun, it's also like more profitable and like a better sort of way of approaching things. And like, you know, hopefully that's true, and it certainly would be nice if it was. And I think it is. So I think, yeah, that's part of that. And then, you know, I think another thing is this just idea of going back to the R naught analogy of something growing is like, it's just, we're really bad, you know, humans are just really bad at exponential trends. You know, I think there's there's a great story. I think like AT&T or someone commissioned, you know, one of the big management consulting firms, McKinsey or Deloitte or someone, to do a big study in like 1995. Maybe it was like 1980. I'll mess the dates up or something. It was like, how many people are going to have cell phones? It probably would have been like 1980. It would have been like, and they were like, you know, in 2020 or something, there will be like 10,000 cell phones, right? Because we're like, you know, right now there's 50 and whatever, and they were off by like 100x. Like they were off by like this massive factor.
It's like the CEO of IBM said, hey, there's maximum 5 computers, and
Right,
there's going to be
exactly.
5 supercomputers and no other need for it.
Right. Yeah, and I think that, like, yeah, that's another good. There's another good example. So I think like that's, when you see something and it seems to be growing quickly, even if it's really small, that's like a big advantage. Yeah, as you mentioned, like Peter Thiel has this idea of like, what are the secrets, right? And like the secret of PayPal was like, at the time it was like the idea that people put their credit cards in the internet was like crazy. Like, I'm not going to put my credit card on this freaking internet thing. This is insane. But like people were doing, eBay was already a thing right there, right? It's like people were already like putting credit cards and like sending money and stuff on the internet. Like not many people, but a few people, and it was like growing really quickly, right? Like I even think there's I don't know if it's one of the Thiel or Bezos has some story where they just like looked at the growth rate, right? It was like, they looked at like internet users like 93, 94, 95, and it was like going up, 10x every year. And it was like, if you extrapolate this out for like 10 more years, this is like, this is the most impactful technology of generation. But I think, people we just don't tend to sort of work that out. And I think, yeah, you kind of have to like play the math out to some extent for it to make sense.
Yeah, I think that's a really good transition to thinking about extrapolation. So recognizing something that is still small in an absolute sense, but is growing very quickly, and being able to guess at a potential future, where it's going. I think, this year being a great example of something that is ignored to the point that it no longer can't be ignored. And I'm curious, why are we so bad at extrapolating exponentially? But why is that something that as a culture, as a society, we have so much difficulty with?
Yeah, I mean, the explanation that makes the most sense to me is kind of like the evolutionary biology, right? Like if you go back, whatever you want to call modernity, the last 2,000 years in like evolutionary history is like a very tiny blip, right? Like there's no meaningful, like humans aren't biologically meaningfully different than they were 2,000 years ago, but obviously civilization is. And if you want to go back and you look at Homo sapiens or Homo sapien ancestors, like the environments they were living in were, Nassim Taleb has this idea of mediocre stand versus extreme stand, that sort of the evolutionary environment for humans was mediocre stand, right? Like you never, the herd of wildebeest didn't like 10x month over month, right? Like it doesn't work that way. That sort of thing kind of never happened. And they're just not in sort of like natural phenomena. You don't see these sort of like extreme events, right? It tends to be civilizational things, human things, the internet, or, if you had like a infectious disease in 5,000 BC, right? Like it killed the tribe, killed the 50 people in the tribe. They were right there, and then they were all dead. And like, that was the end of it. Like there was no, this like hyper connected sort of thing never existed. So I think most of it's just like, the evolutionary biology is such that like we're just bad at it because we never really had to do it. And I think even, it's interesting using sort of like COVID as an example, most professions or most careers, most people still don't have to like do that in any capacity. I was talking with a friend of mine that's a doctor in New York, and he was like, he'd previously been an options trader. He came out of finance and he went back to medical school. And, he was telling me basically he had this like serious conversation with his procurement person in like January. It's like, I need you to order 20,000 N95 masks right now because they're all going to be out of stock in 2 weeks, kind of thing. And he had this big fight with the procurement guy. He was like, "Oh, this is stupid. Like, no, we're not going to, we can order more later." And he was saying there's all these conversations he had similar with doctors where like, his guess was it was like a math background. It's like if they never take doctors that had just done science and not done math, were like they all thought the COVID thing was kind of dumb, and then all the ones that had done math were like, "Oh, this is going to be a huge deal." But there's this huge bifurcation just based on like, does this person have sort of professional or some sort of meaningful experience of like playing with these numbers, where they've developed some, they know that their intuition is bad about it, and they're self-aware about that thing to know that. So I think it is trainable, right? Like it is fixable. You can sort of like develop an intuition around how that works, but I think the natural bias is very bad, right? Like it's like if you go out and you just swing a golf club and you've never swung a golf club before, like your swing sucks, because it's not a natural movement. It doesn't feel natural. You have to go through training. I think it's sort of the same thing.
It reminds me a lot of a post you did about attracting luck, and the implication being that everything that matters occurs in the fat tails, that there are low probability but high impact events. And so, I think in a sense, this is the exposure to positive convexity, or another way of thinking it is optimizing for optionality, where many times the outcome is, if it's bad, it's not so bad, right? It's like a risk of a very small loss or no loss at all, but the potential for very large upside. How do you think about those implications for us, maybe in career terms, if all of the action is happening on the fat tails? How do we position ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of the fat tail is, there's sort of two kinds of distributions, right? They call them normal distributions and fat tail distributions. As you said, like the idea of fat tail distribution is basically unexpected events are more expected than most people think. There seems a lot of, calls these the black swans, right? You have these low impact, but low probability but extremely high impact events. I think, part of that, the example I give in the post, I think you mentioned, one way of thinking about it is, I think people tend to focus too much on sort of like the middle people. I give the example of like, how Taylor Swift like prices concert tickets, right? So it's like most people, like, I don't know, if you ask me how much I'd be willing to pay to go to a Taylor Swift concert, it's like, I like Taylor Swift, but I'm not super into it. I don't know, I'd pay $50 or something, right? But there's like some group of people that are like, would pay $10,000 or 20 for the super premium. I want to meet Taylor before the show. I want to get in a box. I want to like have a recording. I want to do sort of all this stuff. And the sort of the interesting math here for me, at least, is you have this idea of like the 80-20 principle, which I think most people are familiar with it. 80% of your results is a result of 20% of your actions. And Perry Marshall has a great book called 80-20 Sales and Marketing. And actually the appendix is the best chapter of the book. And he goes into this idea that the 80-20 principle is fractal or self-similar at different scales. You have the 80-20, but then you also have the 80-20 of the 80-20, which is the 4-64. So you have 4% of your actions that are responsible for 64%. And then you have the 80-20 of the 464, which is it's like 1.2 or 0.8 in 52. But roughly it's like 1% is responsible for 50%. And like that's frequently true if you look at like a business, like usually often 1% of their customer base will be responsible for 50% of the revenue, right? Like that's probably true in like different, like, yeah, Taylor Swift could like price her concert tickets kind of following this power law distribution. So I think one way, like in general for business owners or freelance type people, is to think about like how can you sort of better serve that 1%, right? Like I think people spend too much time. And this is like a common thing. Like right, salespeople will spend all this time prospecting for new clients and like very little time like doing account management and like interacting with their existing clients. When like almost always it's like much more profitable to just like doing relationship stuff. And like someone's already bought, if you're a car salesman, someone's already bought a car from you, is like much more likely to buy a car from you again. Then you got to go find some random person that you have no relationship with, no rapport, and sort of build that up from scratch. And then I think, the other thing is just like, try to think about, I think it's personal to everyone, like what are those sort of like 1% activities that lead to, 50% results. Like if you look back over the last 5 years of your life, can you like point to specific things like this, this was a relatively low effort thing that had very high impact results. Blogging for me was one of those things early. I started doing that in like 2011, 2012. And it was like, 2 hours a week, but it was like, I'd like meet interesting people. Like it was just like relative. I was like, oh, I should like keep doing this thing. It's relatively little effort and, it's relatively high upside. And so I think just trying to, usually my process for that has always been, I try to do like a quarterly or annual thing where I like look back and try and look at like, okay, over the last 90 days, the last year, like what are the few activities that had like disproportionately important results, and then how can I double down on that in some capacity.
I love that. It's such an interesting framing to realize, hey, 1% of the things that I'm doing are driving 50% of the returns. And so there's a two-part question there. What are the few things that are doing that are having the greatest impact? And then that double down decision, which is I'm going to stop doing some of these other things which are not valuable, stop treating everything I'm doing as equal, and find ways to fractally dig deeper into the things that are driving the most return. Is that I love the way of thinking about the way we invest in terms of a power law. And I think the biggest investments we make are always where we spend our time. And so if we think about time as a power law, the most important thing that we could be doing is more important than everything else we could be doing combined. And so that leads to things like reflecting and planning become very, very high leverage activities because they help to reveal that most important thing, but also that a lot of the things that we're doing that we backwards rationalize as high impact really are negative impact because they get in the way of doing this 1% of things that really matter.
Totally.
Taylor, I love this sharing of blogging as something that has low effort, high upside. I would love to know, what other types of optionality are you currently exploring? What's on? I think you'd mentioned, hey, when you see something that you think might be a trend, your approach is just to, only the autodidacts are free, just to become completely immersed in that. What types of optionality are you immersing yourself in right now?
So like I said, one other big one, just I think I'm trying to do this to a better job now. And I feel like I've been trying to sort of like double down on this in some capacity for 10 years. And I still feel like I could sort of invest more, is just, different sort of investing in relationships in different ways, whether that's like hosting events and, both on like a social and a professional level. On a social level, just like having really good friends, like makes, at that point, you're kind of winning, right? Like there's not a lot of margin to improve at that point. And then I think also like on a professional level, at least my inbuilt tendency is just kind of like go head down and just work on stuff and like not pull up and interact as much. And I notice, like some of the most effective people I know, like write really long emails, right? Like I'll ask them like, hey, what do you think about this thing? And they'll send me this like really robust 5-paragraph thing where they've like thought through it. I'm like, oh, they're great at that. You know what I mean? It's like, I know Chris is really good at planning stuff or whatever. Cause I've seen, like, I've read your blog post, or you sent me, like, we've talked about it in so long, and like, I can sort of evaluate that expertise. So I think that's sort of establishing relationships has been like another sort of big one. I guess right now I'm really interested the sort of Bitcoin, blockchain, crypto space, or public blockchain space in general is like still very interesting to me. And most people I talk to still think it's dumb, which makes me think there's a lot of room left to have something play out there over the next 20 years. I think that's a long-term thing. As you mentioned, I run a hedge fund now that focuses on tail risk and long volatility strategies. That's sort of an aspect of the investing world that's really interesting to me right now. And I'm trying to do more with and learn more about. I think those are maybe the big ones for me at this moment.
If I can identify a commonality there, I think this investment metaphor really hits home. Is these are long-term investments, and it's not clear which part of the portfolio is going to pay off. I remember the story you were telling about marketing your book, where you suspected that 50% of your book sales came back to 2 emails that you had sent out. And we were talking about relationships and how, relationships are very much a long-term investment, and that, many of our opportunities or, amazing experiences can be traced back to a couple of initial interactions. And the things that no one is asking for from us generally become the most important, that they're very self-guided kind of long-term actions. And it strikes me, if the commonality there, it goes back to your superpower of being able to invest and go deep and being willing to have a long time horizon, that these investments play off in kind of unexpected ways. And you can be in that niche for a long time before it becomes normal, right? It's the overnight success that was really 10 years of gym time ahead of time. I'm curious about that. Is like, we live in a world that rewards short-term results. Everything gets reduced down 280 characters. What have you done for me lately? What's the sales numbers at? How do you think about prioritizing these long-term timescales? It's like you said, in terms of exponential growth, you need to have a long time scale in order for things to go vertical.
Yeah. There's a really interesting idea. One of the sort of parts of the Bitcoin subculture is Austrian economics, which is like one of the sort of the, I guess, least academically accepted or sort of least academically popular schools of sort of economic thoughts. But it has some really interesting ideas. And one of them is this idea of what they call time preference. So like, they do these experiments with people, but like if you have a savings account that earns 5% a year, the question is, would you rather have $100 now or $105 a year from now? And so I think, I think it's generally true. I think most people have too high of time preference, right? Like they want to have the thing sooner. And when you're dealing with something that compounds, that future potential is so vast compared to sort of what is presently available. Like I'm sure there's a slightly butcher the numbers, but it's like if you started filling up the Yankee Stadium with water, you start with 1 drop, and then the next minute you do 2 drops, and then you do 4 drops of water. Maybe you start with like the doubling. But the end of it is basically at like 50 minutes, basically you're just where like the whole infield is damp. It just looks like someone like sprinklered the infield. And at 60 minutes, the stadium is like overflowing with water. And so you have that, that back end of that exponential curve is just so steep. And so I think that's, once I kind of started to understand that idea in some way, that just seemed like such a big opportunity, right? The grain of rice that doubles every day, and eventually the king has to give the whole kingdom to the person after 30 days, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Like that's another good example of that. But I think that's right. Like it's like I think in I try to approach things like a lot of Bitcoin or crypto is a good example. It's like how a lot of people approach like how can this make a ton of money in like the next 6 months, and like wouldn't that be awesome? And like it would be awesome. But the potential future rewards, right? The compound growth rate of that is very, very high. And I think that, the game theory idea of like the iterated prisoner's dilemma, that when you're cooperating with other people, right, you're enhancing the future wealth, however you want to calculate wealth in those terms, of both individuals, and that compounds over time.
Yeah, thanks. It's so hard to overestimate compounding and said it's all a function of time. So I love thinking about, hey, what are the things that are interesting enough for you that you're willing to spend a lot of your time on it with no promise of return? Because sometimes it might not go anywhere, but if you needing to stick with something for long enough to see things play out.
Yeah, I think that's always that's always one of my heuristics. I have like a project heuristic list. Like, should I take on this project? And one of them is like, could I see myself spending at least 5 years on this? And I think it's very, it's like all the poor decisions I've made have always been like, oh, this is like a great opportunity. I'll just like do this for 6 months, even though it's like not the thing I'm that excited about. And then I'll like go do the other thing that I'm like actually excited about. And that's never worked. At least for me, that's never worked.
It's advice I give a lot. It's when I talk about the difference between productivity and performance, is that productivity is moving as fast as you can along the path, and performance is just taking the most direct path, the closest to the straight line. And we put these brick walls between ourselves and the things that we want. It was like, okay, I'm going to go work for McKinsey for 2 years, and then I'm going to go to the MBA, and I'm going to do the investment banking, and then I can finally do the thing that I really want to do, rather than finding a way to just go at it directly. That all of these prerequisites are really just ways of delaying. I want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A today. So if any of you guys have questions you'd like to ask Taylor, be sure to add those into the Q&A and upvote any questions that you find interesting. One last question for you, Taylor, before we switch it over to Q&A. What recommendation would you have to someone who wants to create more upside in their career? Some of these, low effort but potentially high impact things that we can be doing. What comes to mind?
I think optimize for interesting, which is one of the ideas we've sort of been bringing back and up. Like, I think that's a big one. I think sort of a corollary to that, or sort of adjacent to that, is this idea of like, you have to be willing to work on small things, or things that seem relatively trivial, right? Like, if once 50% of people are doing it, it can only double, right? Like, that's it. That's the maximum sort of thing. But if 1/100,000th of 1% of people are like into it, then like the potential growth rate from there is very, very high. So I think part of it's that optimization for interesting, and then also sort of like what is what is some, as you said, the Tealian secret idea. What is something that you or your subculture sort of think about that doesn't seem broadly applicable. And then, I think, beyond that, the other things that have been impactful for me is, taking time to try and like, not just get interested in those things, learn about those things, but like share that in some capacity, whether that's, blogging and Twitter has been most of the ways I've done that. But, YouTube, podcast, hosting events, there's a jillion ways to sort of like share that, that kind of stuff. So I think that balance between sort of sharing what you're learning and then trying to learn new interesting things, and you can create sort of a very positive feedback loop.
Awesome. Thanks, Taylor. First question is from Sunil. Taylor, in these crazy times, how does one live with uncertainty? What are your go-to mental models which are value in dealing with uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess from a mental model perspective, I really like the OODA loop framework, and just sort of like John Boyd's work in general. He's the guy that came up with the OODA loop idea. But OODA it's an acronym for observe, orient, decide, act. And the idea is that, this is a process which everyone does intuitively, right? It's like, I observe that I'm hungry, I orient by going to Yelp, I decide that I want to eat Chick-fil-A, I get in my car and drive to Chick-fil-A, or whatever. And then, you're also making this on at many different levels at many different times, right? I observe that I don't like my job. I orient by like, trying to talk to people in my network of like other jobs that could be more interesting or fulfilling or whatever. And, I decide to change. And and I act on that change. So I think that's like one sort of way that's helpful for me of thinking about it. I guess just like sort of more practice, trying to, practically for me, like when I get in, that's just everything feels like super uncertain and out of control. A lot of times I just need like a break. I just need to like take 3 days off and like go to the lake or like just go, play video games or something and just kind of like let everything simmer. Because I think a lot of times it's just, for me, and I think a lot of people, like you just lose the forest for the trees kind of thing, right? Like everything feels super uncertain. It's like actually not that uncertain. You're just like really lost in the weeds of it. And if you can take a step back, you get a lot of space. That's sort of one thing that's always helpful for me. I try to do once a quarter, I'll take like a day or two and do kind of just like not respond to email, not doing a bunch of messages, but just do sort of like a big picture kind of review and just think about things and try and sort of reorient myself, if you will, in the OODA loop example. And I almost invariably find it like after I take like 2 or 3 days and just sort of like chill out, do some thinking, do some planning, that like the amount of a lot of the uncertainty was perceived uncertainty and not sort of actual underlying uncertainty.
Yeah, for those of you guys who know me, know how much I love meditation metaphors. And one of my favorites, the teacher is saying, hey, make sure you sit down 30 minutes every day, no matter what is going on. And if you don't have 30 minutes, do it for 2 hours, which is just another way of saying the less sure you are of what you're doing, or the more busy and frantic things feel, the more important it is to get away and to reorient yourself. And this is something that's always counterintuitive, and it's a surprisingly difficult assignment that I often give my clients who have many things flying at them and are just too busy to think or plan, is to just take a day off and don't touch their computer or phone. And it's really surprising how powerful it can be to restore that sense of perspective. It also reminds me, I mean, I love the OODA loop so much, and we've nerded out about it quite a bit. And so when I talk about, in a poker sense, how I am trying to get inside of my opponent's loop, that they are acting on an outdated model of the world, that I can anticipate their response, the decision and action that they make based off of a shared mental model. And thus I can have their observations out of concordance with reality. And that this was one of John Boyd's key observations when he was looking at fighter pilots and which fighter pilot would win in a dogfight. It was the fighter pilot who was able to reorient both more accurately to what was happening, but also faster. And that the tightness of this feedback loop that we find ourselves in is proportional to our speed for progress. So I can't help but ask a follow-up is, what strategies do you have to reorient to reality faster?
Yeah, I have one John Boyd story that I thought would be interesting as you were thinking. He was also a big proponent of, there was like the big trend in the US military was just these like bigger, weightier planes. Like you've seen like Top Gun and like F-14s and stuff. There's a scene in Top Gun where it's talking about like why Top Gun was started, but basically the Soviet MiGs, which are like much smaller, much cheaper, much quote unquote worse planes than the F-14s were, I think like they calculate the ratio of like who's shooting down who and all that kind of stuff. But the MiGs were just like much more effective. And so like, everyone was sort of upset, but like the key thing, they were just more maneuverable, right? So even though they had less firepower and less missiles and weaker engines and everything else, they were just smaller and more maneuverable. And Boyd was really influential. He was one of the big, I think it's called the Warthog airplane, but it's like, it looks ugly. It's just the ugliest looking plane you've ever seen in your life. It's got like 2 big turbines. I think it's like mostly the Marines use them. But it's like really effective. And so I think there's like an analogy there. It's like these things that look kind of like dumb or silly or ugly or whatever, like, are often really effective. You sort of, to go to your question of like, what are the sort of things that I do to orient. I mean, I think the biggest thing for me is I have a pretty, like, a regular, just kind of weekly and quarterly review process. Like I tend to try to schedule in times deliberately for when I'm going to do that kind of stuff. So usually every Saturday morning, I'll take like 2 hours and just like look through my calendar for the past week, look through my task list for the past week, and kind of do a chance like what went like unexpectedly well, right? Like this call that I thought was going to be a waste of time was actually like super interesting, and I learned a ton from this person. And I hope that it's like, where did I meet them? Is there like any way maybe I should schedule another call with them or whatever it is. So yeah, I think just having those like built-in stops or just built-in barriers or breaks or whatever you want to call them, I think is probably the most helpful thing for me.
Yeah, it's really critical to close the loop. And it's something that I see a lot of resistance from, especially those who consider themselves creatives. So this could be writing, this could be design, any type of pursuit where you see your role to go from 0 to 1 to create things that didn't exist. But looking at many of the most creative people throughout history, those who came up with scientific theorems or, wrote the post that became the concept that we all reference, they were incredibly systematic about their creativity, that having this structure to regularly review what they were doing was leading to the results that they wanted. Those are the ones who went on to have the greatest impact. That creativity, having interesting and new ideas, is not only not counter to having this structure, but in my opinion, that the structure becomes essential for the creativity that happens in the space in between.
For sure, yeah, personally true for me.
Question from Jason. So we have a specific example of the secular trend of psychedelics that's happening right now. So we see, mental health really coming to the forefront. We've seen this recently with, meditation and yoga having a resurgence. And it seems like that the cultural opinion of things as potential, not only not harmful, but potentially very beneficial. There's been studies recently in psychedelics as far as being useful for addiction and depression when conducted in correct setting, clinical settings. Jason's curious, what's your opinion on some of the consequences that you predict from this current societal change?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about psychedelics. Whatever, I've read the same 3 blog posts everyone else read about them, kind of thing, is my level of knowledge. But yeah, it seems like interesting. Going back, we're talking about thinking about what's trends to bet on or whatever. Like everyone that's into it is like really into it, right? It's like, you know what I mean? Like no one's like meh about it for the most part. Like it's everyone's like, oh yeah, this is like, you got to do this. It's going to change your life forever. Kind of things. Like that makes me think it's like probably a good trend to bet on. Like the legalization thing seems to be moving along. I'm not like paying close attention to that, but I know they're like going, stage 3 or stage 4. The trial level is increasing and all that kind of stuff. And it does seem to have that characteristic of like everyone that's into it is like real. You know what I mean? The R naught is like greater than 1, right? Like everyone that does it like convinces at least 2 other people to do it. And so like you just keep playing out that growth rate and like it ends up being big.
Yeah, virality is everything. And it's the difference between, mercenaries and missionaries. Is you're looking at those who are into it. Are they really into it? Is it the thing that they talk to everyone about? It's like, how long are you in a conversation with them before it comes up? These are pretty good proxies to look out for. And I'm curious. It seems like Bitcoin falls into that camp. You know, we've been talking about paleo a little bit, where it's like, how long are you talking to this person before they bring up that they're doing paleo right now? Are there any other examples that you can think of where it's almost cult-like in the fanaticism, where that speed to someone bringing something up in conversation seems to be that biggest factor for word of mouth virality?
Yeah, that's usually a way of thinking. I'd say there's some line about like the difference between a cult and a religion is like adoption percentage, right? Like you cross some threshold and now it's not a cult, it's a religion. Um, yeah, that's an interesting question. What else are people really into? I don't know, like the AI people seem to be kind of like people that are into AI are like really into it, kind of stuff. That's another, yeah, I think like Bitcoin is certainly like that, where like, you know, it borders and goes into religion, I think, for a lot of people. You know, psychedelics is a good one. What else do people really, I think like, yeah, like other health, there seems to be like the vegetable oil crusade seems to be like picking up
Yeah.
steam. That's, I know a lot of people are like just like militant about you can't have vegetable oil kind of thing. And someone was tweeting, it's like, oh, why can't I go to Kroger and buy sweet potato fries, not vegetable oil? And I was like, oh man, that's a business right there. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how the economics of that business work or whatever, but like, yeah, like in 10 years, like that's going to be a big, that's going to be a huge thing. Like people, that's going to, consumer preferences seem to be changing there. What else? I don't know. Yeah, it's a good question. If I had other, I guess the city state people to like start your, you know, like the seasteading and that whole movement. Like those people are like really passionate about it. And like, you know, yeah, like very sort of like evangelical. I think that's like another interesting trend. And yeah, I don't know. I guess that's they call them secrets because they're hard to think of. You know, it's like
Yeah.
if I knew a lot of them, they wouldn't be very secret. You know, almost by definition.
Yeah, a question from Jason. So I think this is a good continuation of the theme around living with uncertainty. So there's one approach to uncertainty, which is trying to reduce the uncertainty. Can we identify what the crux of it is and find some way of measuring and tracking it so that we can better predict? But it seems like an unexplored angle from today is the anti-fragile notion, admitting, hey, the world is at least somewhat undeterministic and uncertainty is inevitable and some aspects of the future are unknowable. And I think one of your key insights that led to the creation of Mutiny Fund is that most of us are, as you put it, short volatility, where Taleb gives the image of a glass jar sitting on the edge of the table, where anything occurring is bad for the glass jar. That many of our systems are set up so that any change is bad for us, and thus become very resistant to change. And this notion that we can become long volatility, that change, and especially large unpredictable change, can actually benefit us. But we'd love to hear how you think about that and how it you know led to your thinking on creating the fund.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think part of one of the interesting ideas that Taleb has in general, and particularly as it applies to markets, is that if you have something which is, you know, I guess at least in market specific, I'm trying to figure this is more general, but if you reduce the short-term volatility, you increase the long-term volatility. So like what we would expect if that's happening is you'd expect sort of black swan or, you know, these sort of high probability events to be less frequent. but more severe.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, like there's a there's a nonlinearity to the severity, right? Losing 40%, losing 80% of your portfolio is more than twice as bad as losing 40%. And losing 90% is more than 10% worse than losing 80%, right? It's there's a nonlinearity to how that all plays out, and in the case of investing specifically, that has a huge impact on the ability to compound wealth over time, right? If you have a 50% drawdown in your portfolio, you have to make 100% just to get back to where you started. And so if you're able to reduce those sorts of drawdowns, your long-term compounded growth rate is much higher. Just getting back to what we're talking about that back end of the exponential curve being very steep, and how that's sort of underestimated. So yeah, I think that that was sort of the impetus that got me interested. I think that's another area that's a very niche area, but the people that are like into that sort of long volatility investment stuff are really into it, and most people aren't. And so to me, that seems like it's an interesting bet to take in that regard.
Well, especially because in investing, you need to be both right and contrarian. If everyone was into it, it probably wouldn't be as good of a trade.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, trades get trotted out, right? Everyone does you do the good trade, and it works, and then the consultants get a hold of it, and the consultants go to the pension funds and pitch the pension funds on it, and the pension funds do it, and then it stops working. And that's the cycle, right?
Well, Taylor, awesome. Thank you so much for being here. And guys, really appreciate the great questions, all the fun chatter. Hopefully you came away from today with a little bit better of understanding on how you can recognize how some of your normals might become future normals for larger groups of people, maybe ways that you can become more anti-fragile or create more optionality in your life and career. Taylor, any final thoughts to leave the audience with today?
No, thank you for having me. This was fun.
Succinct and direct. I love it. So quick reminder, guys, this is going to be, this was recorded, and this is going to be sent out in an email on Tuesday and posted on the Forcing Function website with the full transcript and show notes, everything that was mentioned or discussed today, if you want to go find that. Quick reminder that the next lunch hour we're going to be hosting is on October 15th with Spencer Greenberg. And if you'd like to check out the previous lunch hour conversations that we've done, you can also find that at forcingfunction.com/lunch-hour. With that, thank you guys so much for being here, and we'll see you guys again on the 15th. Thanks, Taylor.
Thanks, guys.